the lecture on China in the medieval time period. We're going to start with a little bit of context, and then we'll move on to the one dynasty that you need to know for the time period, which is called the Song Dynasty. So when we're looking at China, we're going to look at, for context, around the same time that Rome fell, because a similar thing is going to happen in China. There was a dynasty named the Han Dynasty that collapses around 220 CE, so a little bit before the Roman Empire fell. When the Han Dynasty collapsed, China is going to pick up the pieces pretty quickly, unlike Rome, and they're going to continue ruling on with dynasties and empires. There were a few hundred years where they have to get themselves together and pick themselves up, but they're going to be able to pretty quickly compared to Europe. In this time period, when they're not really unified, Confucianism is going to weaken, and that really allows for Buddhism and Taoism to take prominence. And Buddhism is going to come in from northern India. So when we see Confucianism weaken, that allows Buddhism to come in. Let me move this right here. In terms of the dynasties, you don't need to know them. This is just some information on the Sui dynasty. They're going to use Buddhism pretty heavily. The one thing to know from the Sui dynasty is that they start building the Grand Canal, which is going to connect northern and southern China. And it becomes a really, really big influence in the Song dynasty because it's going to bring crops from the south up to the north, where there was a large population. They collapsed because of the reason that most dynasties and empires collapsed. They overextended, they were too ambitious militarily. And then we have the Tang dynasty, and I know this is a funny shape for the Tang dynasty. They ruled for about 300 years. Chang'an, the capital city for the Sui dynasty, is going to remain the capital. It's going to be really influential. And Buddhism is actually going to become a predominant part of early Tang dynasty. They even have a female Buddhist ruler, which is really, really neat for Chinese history. In terms of Buddhism, there's a lot of things that you need to know for this class that maybe you learned last year in terms of like what Buddhism was all about that we're not going to cover. So if you need to look back at that, you can do some research on what Buddhism was really about. In terms of its influence in China, Buddhism's going to enter Han China via Silk Road routes from northern India, beginning around the 1st and 2nd century CE when the Han Dynasty was ruling. The first documented efforts of Buddhist monks coming into China was around the 2nd century CE. And we start to see a direct contact between Central Asia and Chinese Buddhism, and that's going to continue throughout the 3rd to the 7th centuries, well into the Tang period. As of 2009, China has the largest population of Buddhists in the world at around 250 million. Thailand comes second at around 70 million. So you can see the true influence that Buddhism has had on Chinese history. China at the time still used Taoism. They blended it with Buddhism. It was an easy blend. And we're going to see towards the later part of the Tang Dynasty, Confucian scholars are going to start becoming resistant towards Buddhism because it promoted a little bit more freedom in society and didn't keep that structured society that Chinese Confucian scholars really liked. So we see them starting to challenge Buddhism. In terms of the types of Buddhism, and here you can see the spread of Buddhism. So here's where it starts, and you can see the spread. As for the types of Buddhism, you guys really need to know Mahayana and Theravada, and I'll show you in the next slide what those are. Theravada is going to stick more into South Asia and Southeast Asia. So Theravada Buddhism is going to be more of a traditional Buddhism where we don't really see a lot of gods being worshipped. You see mostly monks and meditation and the Eightfold Path. In terms of Mahayana Buddhism, that's going to spread more to East Asia. That's where we see the use of gods in Buddhism. So I'll explain that in the next slide. Theravada is more of your traditional Buddhism seen in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, and other parts of Southeast Asia. And they're going to promote the concept of teaching of analysis, suggesting that the seeker of religion should gain insights from their own experiences, they should have reasoning, and it should be combined with being a scholar on Buddhism and usually looking towards monks. There was a group of people called the Bodhisattvas who would seek enlightenment, but they would not seek enlightenment to then just be fulfilled for themselves. They would seek enlightenment to be completely aware of what enlightenment is and how to get there, and then they would become teachers for other people who would want to seek the same thing. So Bodhisattvas are like these cool Buddhist teachers, monks who have reached enlightenment, who are then going to teach others how to do that. In Mahayana Buddhism, we also see Bodhisattvas, and they're going to help teach other Buddhists how to reach enlightenment. Mahayana Buddhism is a little bit differently. You would see it in China, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Mongolia, and other parts of Southeast Asia. And as Buddhism continued to spread throughout East Asia, it's going to take on some cultural elements that are going to make this Mahayana Buddhism look different than Theravada. Promotes the idea that an aspirer or a religious convert should not just seek personal enlightenment, but the enlightenment of all beings. It accepts a wide range of approaches to enlightenment, not just meditation, but also doing selfless work, working for the world of others. And that's going to connect a little bit to China's view of a person really being a large part of society's success. And what they're going to do that's a little bit different is they develop a lot of different gods in different areas of East Asia that are going to be used to actually create worship with Buddhism rather than just self-meditation. So we see it becoming more of a religion where you worship gods. There's another sect of Buddhism that you don't really need to know for the test, but I wanted to recognize it, and it's Buddhism in Tibet. And it's the best known for being the face of the Dalai Lama, who is considered the head of the Buddhist faith. It combines Mahayana Buddhism with a little bit of shamanism, which is a bit more ancient. And you see more ritual and spiritual practices like mantras and yoga. And it becomes almost this like supernatural Buddhism that you would almost compare to Sufism and Bhakti with Hinduism. So it's an interesting religion. When you go to East Asia and Southeast Asia, Buddhism is going to look different in pretty much every country that you go to, because as it spreads, people are going to conform it to fit with their cultures, kind of how we saw Islam spreading. In the Tang Dynasty, Buddhist monks are actually going to be treated pretty well because the leaders of the Tang Dynasty are going to ask Buddhist monks for favor in return for money. But we see that eventually when Confucian scholars start to challenge Buddhism, that's when the influence of Buddhism is going to fall a bit. The Tang Dynasty is going to decline. They lose a battle to the Islamic armies. They have an internal rebellion. It was actually really, really intense. You can look it up on your own. And they started to have a hatred of outsiders, which is going to cause their overall decline. And we see this in the Mandate of Heaven. In the Mandate of Heaven, it's believed that when a dynasty starts to lose their power from the gods, they're going to ultimately decline. And that's what happens to the Tang Dynasty. If you want to learn all the dynasties, we can do this in class. It's called the Chinese Dynasty Song, and it helps you learn the dynasties in order. The dynasty that you need to know the most for this class, for this time period of medieval China, is the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty is going to come about after some fighting between different regions of China after the Tang Dynasty falls, but they're going to rule for a couple hundred years. Their capital is at Hangzhou, right here in China. It's a little bit more in the coastal regions of China. And they're going to utilize mostly Confucianism and bureaucracy to keep their rule. We see them using those old stepping stones of Confucianism to keep their dynasty tight and reined in. And we see things like meritocracy, where you are given positions based on hard work, filial piety, based on respecting your families and your elders. And we see family, again, becoming a central part of Chinese society. We see the resurgence of the civil service examination. It's going to be even more intense because now they've developed paper and woodblock printing, which allows people more access to books. We see academies opening to train government workers and education becoming more and more important. The impact, we see a stable bureaucracy. The Song dynasty ruled very, very well. Again, a little bit more tight, like China used to be, whereas in the Tang dynasty, it loosened up a little bit. And now we see Chinese bureaucracy becoming a little bit more tight. And if it were not for the Mongols, they probably would have ruled for much longer. We're looking at like essay development. One of the essays that you guys are going to be writing is you look at changes and continuities within regions. And one major continuity in China is imperial bureaucracy, or having an empire that's broken up to become efficient, in which they appoint officials to carry out the empire's policies. And we see that in the Song dynasty, but a change is that we see it expanded, and it's based more on scholar gentry or Chinese men who are educated rather than the inherited nobility. And we see more of an effort and a focus put on Confucianism. It actually takes power away from landowners who had just inherited their wealth. So we see the growth of scholar gentry. Another continuity is meritocracy, in which an imperial position was received through merit or hard work on civil service examinations. Again, we see a change, not a shift away from meritocracy, but more of an intense focus on meritocracy, especially because now with printing capabilities, we see a new focus on Confucian books like the Analects. And we see expanded opportunities for lower classes where education is going to be provided for them to study these texts. We're going to have a discussion when you come into class on these questions for the civil service exam. Was it democratic? How did it affect society? How did it affect gender roles? How did it affect culture, bureaucracy? And how did it change when it started to be used by the Song dynasty? In terms of what you need to know for its background, it did expand to several social classes, not just people who inherited wealth. And we see that it's more elaborate due to the ability to print books like the Analects. Schools and colleges started to help students prepare for the exams. You read in your reading that they pretty much start right away studying for these exams, only boys. The exams were the central feature for life, especially if you were an upper class boy living in China. Your parents would start educating you instantly. And they did that because Chinese officials were selected based on merit. You wanted to be an official in China. You wanted to serve your government. It was high-paying positions. So they would fight from birth pretty much to get those positions. And it's going to represent a challenge to the established aristocratic families who had held offices just because their rich parents did. It starts to challenge that idea, and it weakens the power of nobles and aristocrats. So here's what you would see for the Chinese civil service exam. And when we do our discussion, I'm going to show you other pictures. Eventually, they would make it about 5 days long, and you would have to eat and sleep in a booth and take your test for those 5 days. And it was really, really intense for these men going through the civil service exam. We see a lot of advancements during the Tang dynasty and especially the Song dynasty in China. Here's a preview of them, and then we'll talk about each of them individually. Neo-Confucianism is the biggest one that you need to know. It was an intense return to Confucian thoughts and putting that into society. We see rapid population growth, especially because of the influx of Champa rice from Vietnam. We see an expansion of the Grand Canal that's going to connect northern and southern China. And we see new steel, iron, textile, and porcelain production that's going to increase the economy of China. Neo-Confucianism is important for you to know. It's going to evolve in China around the Tang Dynasty, and then it's going to be stronger even during the Song Dynasty. We see that society and government's going to become more strict on ethics and education. There was a strong emphasis again on filial piety, your duty to your family, your duty to the emperor, and subordination to the male head of the family, which is going to lead to patriarchy again. We see some incorporated aspects of Buddhism and Taoism. So that's where Confucianism is going to be different than the Confucianism that you know from World History 1. We see it combined with a little bit more of Buddhism and Taoism. And that shows the growing influence of Buddhism. And Neo-Confucianism is going to increase the importance of the scholar gentry class, which becomes educated to be a part of the civil service exam in the government. And again, Confucianism is so central to Chinese society. Like if you have an essay on China, you want to use that as a continuity because it was a huge continuity. And it's going to really come back during the Song Dynasty, and it's going to help the Song Dynasty unite China under this more strict social view. In terms of economic developments, the economy of Song China became very commercialized, meaning they traded a lot and produced a lot, while continuing to depend on peasant and artisanal labor. So they're going to use the peasant class to really boost their economy. The economy is going to flourish because they produce a lot, they expand trade, and they innovate a lot in agriculture and manufacturing. We also see the economy boom because of the Grand Canal. Started during the Sui Dynasty and expanded on during the Song Dynasty. It's a really, really long canal, man-made canal that's going to connect northern and southern China. In northern China, you have large cities with large populations and a lot of manufacturing. And then in southern China, you have more of an agricultural base because it's closer to Vietnam where they're getting a lot of the champa rice. So we see rice, champa rice, coming from southern China to northern China to feed those large populations, and then manufactured goods going from northern China to southern China. They're going to move crops from the south to the north. It increases economic prosperity, it increases interregional trade, and eventually we're going to see it kind of create cultural and political unity in China, because now you can get on a boat and go to southern China, whereas before a lot of people in the north and south were kind of isolated from each other. So here's an image of the Grand Canal today connecting Beijing and Hangzhou. And Hangzhou was the capital of the Song Dynasty. We also see a rapid population growth because of champa rice. It was fast ripening, it was resistant to droughts, and so it's really going to help increase the food intake of people in China and the health, and that leads to population growth. China during the Song Dynasty is considered the most urbanized country in the world, which means they had the most cities. They had dozens of cities, over 100,000. Hangzhou had more than 1 million residents. And we see this network of waterways connecting and providing cheap transportation for people within the country that's really going to unify them. The Song Dynasty is going to have a population that jumps to about 120 million by 1200 CE. And that goes from 50 million from the Tang Dynasty to 120 million in the Song Dynasty. Cities had markets and restaurants. And when you guys are in class, I'm going to show you this scroll that was done during the Song Dynasty that shows you how impactful their cities were. They had hotels. Hotels would serve wine to the elites. And Marco Polo, a famous traveler, went to Hangzhou and said that it was beyond dispute the finest and noblest city in the world, which is significant because he was Italian and he went to a lot of different cities throughout the world. In terms of society, although China was still very militaristic, we see that civilians, especially educated civilians, are actually on the higher side of the social stratification. So you see this scholar gentry, these landowners who are going to be really, really significant with the civil service system. They're going to be at the top of your social pyramid. Then you have peasants in the middle who are going to be doing the farm work. And then different compared to a lot of social classes, you actually see merchants at the bottom. Even though they're going to become fairly rich, China didn't view them as being high on the scale of merit, meaning hard work, because they said that the riches came from the work of others. We see that rapid economic growth and urbanization is going to allow merchants and artisans to try to move up in the social structure, but we still see education and the scholarly being at the top of society. Here's the scroll that we're going to look at as a class. In terms of industry, we see in China large and small scale enterprises. We see by the 11th century, it was providing, these small industries were providing the government with 32,000 suits of armor with their iron industries, 16 million iron arrowheads per year. As for metal, we see coins, tools, construction pieces, bells, and Buddhist monasteries being made from this iron. And the industrial growth is fueled by using fossil fuels, specifically coal. We also see increased production in terms of just other industrial goods. We see the iron industry increasing output of manufactured goods. We see technological innovations like woodblock printing and movable type. You should write this down. Woodblock printing is where they have prints of, on wood, you inscribe different Chinese characters and then you lay them all in this slab and then you put ink on those characters and then you press paper down onto it and it creates a full page of text over and over again rather than having to write it over and over again. And because they have this system, they create more and more books, which is going to influence also the civil service exam and education in general. We also see the invention of gunpowder. I'm going to, on Edmodo, attach a post that's going to have a look at gunpowder, and I want you to watch that video. It's a TED Ed video on gunpowder, if you don't mind. We see gunpowder is going to spread with the Mongols. We're going to look at that. We're going to see gunpowder spread to Europe, and then places like Europe and the Middle East are using gunpowder rapidly. So here's the video you're going to watch. Gunpowder is a mix of different chemicals that was created by alchemists, and it's going to be used for fireworks and weaponry. The Mongols are going to use it and then transfer it throughout their empire. A couple other achievements other than movable type and gunpowder was the creation of a Chinese ship called the Chinese junk. It was designed for long distance commercial trade. It was large. It was like 5 times the size of a European ship. It had a large flat bottom that could carry a lot of goods. And they're going to use this junk to trade throughout East and Southeast Asia. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk next time period about exploration. We also see the invention of paper money. Paper money is going to replace coinage a little bit at this time. Merchants are going to use paper money because it was easier to carry. They nicknamed it flying money because unfortunately, sometimes if you don't have control of it when you're on the trade routes, because they're not used to using paper money, it would literally fly away from them because they're used to using coins. Now they have this light paper money that's going to fly away from them. We also see new naval technology like the improved magnetic compass that's improved especially for sea travel. And that's also going to be spread throughout the Middle East and Europe. So here are some of their innovations. Here's movable type where you print these pages. Here's the new magnetic compass that's improved and gunpowder. Here's a video I'm also going to attach. This shows woodblock printing. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the role of women in the Song dynasty. Women had more rights during the Tang dynasty, especially because of Buddhism, but they lost their status during the Song dynasty. We see that revival of Confucianism that emphasized lowly roles of women, which leads us to continuing to talk about patriarchy in China, which is a continuity. And we see foot binding start. And here's a quote that comes from Song dynasty that's really impactful. The boy leads the girl follows the boy. The duty of husbands is to be resolute and wives to be docile, begins with this. We'll talk about that more in class. The most compelling expression of Confucianism and patriarchy in China during the Song dynasty was foot binding. It was a Chinese practice of tight wrapping a girl's feet, breaking her bones so that her foot would be smaller, 3 to 5 inches. began with dancers and courtesans in the 10th or 11th centuries, but then it became widespread among almost all families in Chinese society. And it's emphasized with this male view of how female beauty is. It emphasized the desire to have small and delicate women. And you see that with this foot binding. And I'm going to also attach a video, this video, this zooms into a weird spot. This video is going to show you a woman who had her feet bound and her kind of views on that. And so please watch this video as well, because it's just really impactful to see her point of view. And in terms of women, we see them lose a lot of power, especially in the economy, because when China starts to become more industrial in terms of textile production, we actually see women lose their status a little bit. We see new workshops and factories are going to replace the work that women would do. Women would still sometimes run restaurants, work as maids, but a lot of them lose, some of their power that they had in society. That's it for this lecture. Next class, we're going to look at the Song Scroll. We're going to look at some goods that came from China, so you can see some of those goods that were coming out of China. And we're going to talk about China's influence over neighboring regions like Korea and Vietnam and Japan. So that's it for this lecture. Thank you for listening.